1970s America. The country was still trying to recover from the trauma of the Vietnam War, social changes were taking place, and young people were discovering their freedom. During this period, a young man who appeared so attractive, charismatic, and trustworthy that no one would suspect him was preparing to become one of history's most horrific serial killers. Theodore Robert Bundy, or Ted Bundy, as everyone knew him. Ted's story begins with an innocent baby. Born on November 24, 1946, in Vermont, Theodore Robert Cowell was surrounded by lies from the very first days of his life. His mother Louise Cowell was only 22 years old, an unmarried woman, and in the conservative America of the 1940s, this situation was a major scandal. Louise's father Samuel was a religious and strict man. To escape this shame, the family sent Louise to a home for unwed mothers in Philadelphia. After giving birth, Louise returned to her family in Vermont and introduced little Theodore as her own brother. Thus, Ted spent the first 6 years of his life as the child of his grandparents. This early identity confusion laid the foundation for his future psychological problems. When he learned his true identity, his trust in the world was shattered, and the line between reality and fiction became blurred. In 1951, Louise moved to Washington with little Ted and married a man named Johnny Bundy. Although Johnny adopted Ted, they never established a real father-son relationship. Ted never accepted his stepfather and considered him beneath his class. Louise, meanwhile, was distant and cold toward her son, perhaps because he reminded her of his father, or perhaps because he brought back painful memories of the past. Ted was a child who attracted attention with his appearance during childhood, a handsome boy. However, those close to him began to notice that he was different. He had difficulty empathizing with other children and struggled to form emotional bonds. Even at age 3, it said that he would arrange kitchen knives around his Aunt Julia's bed, then watch with a smile when she woke up. During his school years, Ted was academically successful but had problems with social relationships. His friends described him as weird. Despite having a high IQ, he was often alone. This loneliness made him introverted and pushed him to live in his fantasy world. At a young age, he began to show interest in pornography, especially violent pornography. During adolescence, he began experiencing stuttering problems. This condition damaged his self-confidence and increased his social anxiety. However, at the same time, he discovered his ability to manipulate others. He was very good at reading people and became skilled at finding their weaknesses. Ted began at the University of Washington in 1965, where he tried to create a new identity for himself. The young man studying psychology was obsessed with understanding the human mind. This obsession was actually an effort to understand and control his own dark impulses. At university, he met Elizabeth Klopfer. Elizabeth was the perfect woman for him, beautiful, educated, from the upper class. Ted tried to be the ideal boyfriend for her. During this 6-year relationship, Elizabeth began to notice Ted's strange behaviors. His nighttime disappearances, finding strange objects in his car, sudden changes in his behavior. During this period, Ted also began to take an interest in politics. He became involved with the Republican Party, which elevated his social status. People saw him as a trustworthy, charismatic young man with a bright future. His mask was so perfect that no one could see the monster within him. In 1972, he applied to study Chinese studies at Stanford University but was rejected. This rejection was a great disappointment for Ted. Despite considering himself very special, he realized he couldn't get everything he wanted. This situation fueled the anger and jealousy within him. At the beginning of 1974, 27-year-old Ted Bundy was ready to kill. Years of accumulated anger, sexual fantasies, and desire for power had brought him to this point. His first victim was a university student named Joni Lenz. On the night of January 4, 1974, Ted entered her home and beat her nearly to death with a metal bar. Joni fortunately survived but suffered permanent brain damage. This attack gave Ted the feeling he desired, absolute power. The pleasure of having complete control over another person's life made him addicted. A month later, he kidnapped 21-year-old student Linda and Healy. Linda's body was never found. Ted's modus operandi had taken shape. He targeted young, beautiful, long-haired women, approaching them like an innocent man who needed help. He would put his arm in a sling asking for help or pretend to struggle with crutches. When his victims approached the car to help him, he would kidnap them. This method was so effective that in 1974, young women in Washington state began disappearing one after another. Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball. Each was an innocent victim who fell into Ted's trap. July 14, 1974, was a sunny summer day at Lake Sammamish State Park. Thousands of people were picnicking, sunbathing, and having fun. Ted Bundy was looking for his prey among this crowd. His arm was in a sling, he looked handsome and trustworthy. That day, many women remembered a man named Ted approaching them and asking for help with his sailboat. Most women had refused to help him because something felt wrong. However, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund didn't return home that day. This incident was the peak of Ted Bundy's audacity. He had kidnapped 2 women in broad daylight, in front of thousands of witnesses. Police were now looking for someone named Ted, but this name was so common that there were thousands of suspects. A few months later, bones found in the forest were determined to belong to Janice and Denise. Remains of other victims were also found in the same area. Ted would take his victims to remote forest areas after killing them, have sexual relations with the corpses, and dismember them. In the fall of 1974, Ted was accepted to the University of Utah Law School. This move was actually to escape the increasing pressure in Washington. When he moved to Utah, local police didn't know his identity yet, and he had a new hunting ground. The same pattern continued in Utah. Melissa Smith, Laura M., Deborah Kent. All were young, beautiful, long-haired women. Ted had become more organized in his murders. He was more careful in selecting his victims, better at hiding bodies, and more skilled at evading police. During this period, a young woman named Carol Duranch became one of the rare victims to escape from Ted's hands. Ted had told her he was a police officer and taken her in his car, but Carol realized his true intentions and managed to escape. This incident would become important evidence in Ted's capture. At law school, Ted maintained the appearance of a perfect student. His professors found him intelligent and hardworking. His classmates were proud of him. No one was aware that he transformed into a monster at night. In early 1975, Ted began traveling to Colorado. The same murders continued here. Karen Campbell, Julie Cunningham, Denise Oliverson. Each became a victim of Ted's increasing bloodthirst. During this period, Ted's murders began to become more savage. He was no longer satisfied with just killing, he was torturing his victims, playing games with them. It was understood that he held some victims captive for days, terrorizing and causing them pain before killing them. Following the murders in Colorado, the FBI got involved. This was one of the first cases in American history where serial murders were investigated at the federal level. Connections began to be made between similar murders in different states. On the night of August 16, 1975, Ted Bundy's luck finally ran out. In Utah, a police officer noticed a suspicious Volkswagen circling the neighborhood. When he tried to stop the car, the driver tried to escape. After a brief chase, Ted was caught. The objects seized in his car aroused suspicion: gloves, ski mask, rope, handcuffs, crowbar. Ted gave innocent explanations for these, but the police were not convinced. The composite sketch made after Carol Duranch's attack resembled Ted. Ted was arrested for the attempted kidnapping of Carol Duranch. In the 1976 trial, he was found guilty and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. However, this was just the tip of the iceberg. Police were now investigating his connection to larger crimes. While in prison, Ted used his right to defend himself as someone trying to become a lawyer. He displayed sharp intelligence in the process using his legal knowledge. This situation earned him a sympathetic image in the media. Many people began to believe he was innocent. Ted, who had been transferred to Aspen to be tried for Karen Campbell's murder in Colorado, made an escape that would go down in history. On June 7, 1977, he obtained permission to use the courthouse library to defend himself. When left alone in the second-floor library, he jumped out the window and escaped. Free for 8 days, Ted hid in the mountains. However, hunger and cold became unbearable for him. He was caught while trying to come down to the city with a stolen car. This escape attempt showed his intelligence and determination. When brought back, security measures were increased. However, Ted didn't give up. He began making plans for a second escape. This time he would prepare more meticulously, calculating every detail in advance. On the night of December 30, 1977, Ted Bundy made his second major escape by climbing out through a hole he had made in the ceiling of his prison cell. He had been planning this for months. He had climbed into the space above his cell and learned the guard's shift changes. With this escape, Ted's bloodiest period would begin. Ted, who went to Florida, completely changed his identity there. He used the name Chris Hagen and lived an anonymous life in Tallahassee. However, the monster within him was stronger. On the night of January 15, 1978, one of the most horrific serial murder incidents in history occurred at the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. Ted entered the dormitory and carried out a systematic massacre. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy lost their lives that night. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner were seriously wounded but survived. Ted's attack was different from his previous ones, more unplanned, more savage, out of control. It was as if all the anger and violence within him had exploded. During the attack, Ted had beaten his victims with clubs, bitten some of them, and sexually assaulted them. The bite mark found on Lisa Levy's body would later become important evidence in Ted's conviction. The same night, Cheryl Thomas was also attacked a few blocks away but survived. Ted's attacks at 3 different locations that night showed that he had completely lost control. After the Chi Omega attack, Ted fled to northern Florida. However, the urge to kill wouldn't leave him alone. On February 9, 1978, he kidnapped 12-year-old Kimberly Leach in Lake City. Kimberly was Ted's youngest known victim. The little girl, kidnapped from the schoolyard, was found dead in the forest 8 weeks later. Ted had raped and killed her after kidnapping her. This murder was the final example showing how deep Ted had sunk. On February 15, 1978, Ted, driving around Florida in a stolen Volkswagen, was stopped by a police officer. This time he couldn't escape. After his identity was determined, it was understood that he was one of the FBI's most wanted criminals. When arrested, Ted was very different from before. The man who once appeared handsome and charismatic now looked tired and worn out. He had been physically and mentally worn down during the long escape process. Ted Bundy's trial process was one of the first murder cases to be broadcast live on television in America. Ted used his right to defend himself, and this situation made him a media phenomenon. In the courtroom, Ted tried to regain his former charm. He gave interviews to journalists and received letters from admirers. He even married a woman named Carol Ann Boone in the courtroom and had a child with her. However, the evidence was very strong. The bite mark he left in the Chi Omega attack, hair samples, eyewitnesses. All showed that he was guilty. On July 24, 1979, he was sentenced to the electric chair. As his death approached, Ted conducted long interviews with FBI agents and psychologists. In these interviews, he partially confessed and provided valuable information about the psychology of serial killers. According to information Ted provided, he had been addicted to violent pornography since childhood. This addiction gradually turned into a desire to apply violence in real life. At first, he engaged in voyeurism, then became aggressive. When selecting his victims, he had certain criteria: young, beautiful, long-haired, university student women. They all resembled his ex-girlfriend Elizabeth. This situation showed that his murders were personal revenge. Ted also confessed that he had sexual relations with his victims even after their deaths, visiting them for days. This information confirmed that he had necrophilic tendencies. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy's execution date was set. In his final days, although he claimed to be repentant, most people believed this was just a game to escape death. In his final interview before execution, he explained how pornography had affected him. However, these explanations didn't seem sincere either. Ted was trying to manipulate until the very end. Outside the prison, two different groups had gathered, those protesting Ted's execution and those celebrating his death. This situation showed the deep division he had created in American society. On the morning of January 24, 1989, at 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. His final words were an apology message directed at his family and the victims' families. During his execution, hundreds of people had gathered outside the prison. Some were shouting, "Fry Bundy fry," others were celebrating. This scene led to debates about America's understanding of justice. With Ted Bundy's death, the legacy he left behind began to be evaluated. Very important information had been obtained from a criminology perspective. The FBI's serial killer profiling techniques were largely based on what was learned from the Ted Bundy case. Thanks to the information he provided, it was understood how serial killers think, how they make selections, how they hunt. This information played an important role in catching later serial killers. The Ted Bundy case fundamentally changed American society's perception of security. Now people began to be more suspicious of strangers. Especially young women learned to be more careful toward men asking for help. Universities increased security measures. Stricter security systems were established in student dormitories. The dangers of walking alone late at night began to be discussed more. Ted Bundy's story continued to live on in the media even after his death. Dozens of books were written, documentaries were made, films were produced. This situation made him a kind of cult figure. Some people began to admire him. The love letters he received while in prison showed how his charm continued. This situation reflected society's contradictory attitude toward violence and criminals. Ted Bundy's story shows how complex a being human is. How can someone who appears perfect from the outside harbor such dark impulses within? This question is still seeking an answer today. His case shows us that evil doesn't always have an ugly face. Sometimes the most trustworthy-looking people can be the most dangerous ones. Ted Bundy is an example that taught this truth in the most painful way. Ted Bundy, the perpetrator of more than 30 murders, left behind many grieving families and a traumatized society with his death. His story contains important lessons for understanding the dark sides of human nature and preventing similar tragedies in the future. Ted Bundy's story has ended, but the questions and lessons he left behind still remain current. Questions such as what lies hidden in the depths of the human mind and how society should deal with evil continue to live on as part of his legacy.